Introduction. We have argued extensively, alongside many others, that the West is currently confronting a meaning crisis, a state wherein the effects of absurdity, anxiety, despair, and alienation affect a pervasive, if at times unrecognized form of nihilism. The existence and symptomology of this crisis has been argued in our other works, namely Zombies in Western Culture, which interrogates the condition through one of its modern mythograms and diagnosing the current age symptomology of the meaning crisis, which examines the various forms of the condition manifest in individual and communal life. A long-form version of this argument has also been presented in the video lecture series, An Awakening from the Meaning Crisis. This paper aims to advance this project by providing a sapiential and spiritual resource for confronting and responding to the nihilistic dimensions of this crisis. We attempt to explore the individual and existential experience of nihilism and to extrapolate from this level of experience to propose a more generalizable cultural normativity for the transformation of discourse as a means of responding to this meaning crisis. While the scope of our discussion will largely center on dyadic interlocution, the application of the practice outlined in this paper also extends to forms of distributed cognition at both individual and cultural scales. The function of what we will call Dialogos turns the privative experience of nothingness into a superlative experience of no-thingness, affording a communicable form of spirituality that is a lived response to nihilism. 2. Formulating the problem. One of the preeminent figures of the Kyoto School, Keiji Nishitani, argued that the main cause of nihilism is the inability to distinguish between the nothingness found in thinkers like Nietzsche and the no-thingness that is experienced as abundance within the Buddhist sunyata. Western thought came to very similar conclusions within the Neoplatonic tradition, which also saw the culmination of the practice of the dialectic. The topics are conjoined in the following passage written by the Neoplatonist Porphyry. As for non-being, one type we engender when alienated from being, the other we acquire preconception of when cleaving close to being. For if we should chance by be alienated from being, we do not have a preconception of the non-being that is beyond being, but we engender non-being as a bogus experience, which happens to someone who has departed from his proper state. For each human being, while remaining one and the same, as it were possible for him truly and on his own initiative to be elevated towards the non-being that is beyond being, may also be set astray towards that non-being that constitutes the collapse of being. Here, Porphyry distinguishes the non-being of nihil from the non-being of theosis, a distinction that inheres the tenets of Neoplatonism, Christianity, and Zen Buddhism. Yet, it is not sufficient for any of these traditions merely to distinguish privative language from the superlative, but to seek an opposite expression for their fittedness. To do this, we must, as the Greek expression provides, avoid both Scylla and Charybdis, the errors of logical equivocation, to see them as unrelated, and logical equivalence, to see them as logically identical. This paper will argue that the psychotechnology of dialectic is a practice of discernment that discloses the effective difference between valences of no-thingness while integrating their aspects. Dialectic cultivates perspectival stereoscopy, a form of contradictory self-identity that functions as an opponent process that resolves into an implicit singleness and depth of being that Buddhists call sunyata, or no-thingness. This dialectic resolution is a traditional feature of the Socratic elenchus, wherein a proposition may be confirmed for accuracy while marked for insufficiency, and in Christian character- characterology, characterology, where soul can be fitted for virtue while being implicated in the fall of man. These two instances of dialectics combine to formulate an existential problem that in being and in being ourselves, we essentially face non-being and being not ourselves. Media vita in morte sumus, as the Gregorian chant cries, in the midst of life we are in death. The aspect of non-being brings us face to face with nihilism, a perennial crisis of meaning that dissolves personhood by angling the affective, spectral, and agent arena relations maintained as the context of livable reality. This paper will offer dialectic as a philosophy whose form of life responds to nihilism by restoring the phenomenal functional telos of religious life. A metanoia, whereby turning to no-thingness, is the realization of being in the non-being of oneself and the realization of being in the non-being of reality. This function of dialectic does not simply apply to an interpersonal resolution but equally to interpersonal life, and develops a convergence between those two dimensions of relation. For Nishitani, confronting no-thingness is the only viable way to face the threat of nihilism and to return to tell the tale. The source tradition of dialectic is not merely Socratic or Buddhist, but also proto-existential. For Kierkegaard, a question of selfhood was the cynosure of the ontotheological orientation. He applied dialectical opponent processing to the self by reconceiving it as a synthesis of spirit, and he developed his exegesis of the sickness unto death, despair, under several aspects of dialectic. Exempla grati as lacking infinitude or finitude. Under this condition, the aspiring movement to be oneself, exempla grati by infinitizing oneself, can invert into a movement away from oneself. This inversion is a forsaking denial, dissolution, or impotent self-consumption. If it lacks dialectic countervalence, the tension that resolves the self-identity, and theologically, in its establishing power. One such aspect of this affliction, which invokes both Porphyry's caution and Nietzsche's abysmal confrontation, is described by what Kierkegaard termed possibility's despair. Now, if possibility outstrips necessity, the self runs away from itself in possibility, so that it has no necessity to return to. This then is possibility's despair. Becoming oneself is a movement one makes just where one is. Becoming is a movement from some place, but becoming oneself is a movement at that place. In the end, it seems as though everything were possible, but that is the very moment that the self is swallowed up by the abyss. As we will argue, the dialectic of no-thingness exercised in Dialogos articulates that place for the becoming of the self, the dialectic resolution of the dichotomous aspects. In so doing, it can respond to the disorientation that fells the metanoic project. For Kierkegaard, condition of despairing over oneself must be understood dialectically, and so must its resolution. Despite traditional charges of radical individualism, there is a distinct dialogic presence in Kierkegaard's theology of selfhood, a relation to another whose ontological grounding resolves the dialectic of an individual's opponent process. For Kierkegaard, of course, this presence has a distinctly Christian character. Stephen Evans notes that while Kierkegaard frequently refers to Socrates as his teacher, He believes in Christ and sees faith in the latter as a formal response to the despair made conscious by Socratic irony. This agape capacity to love one's neighbor or undertake any such works of spirit requires an inward movement to internalize the pattern of Christ as a paradox of actuality. This paradox ameliorates possibilities despair by marriage to necessity, an infinitizing movement away from the earth, where the abyssal imagination runs amok, will simultaneously become the movement to refinitize. And in this bidirectional movement, the self comes to be grounded transparently in the power that establishes it. Kierkegaard analogizes this transparency by describing how a body acclimates to a draft by resolving contradictory sensations, or how consonants and vowels, when fitted together properly, disappear as they resolve into a discourse. In the same way, the syntax of selfhood stereoscopes see further ahead when it is spoken to another. A thou who hears it singularly, who transcendent measure of possibility potentiates the dialectic of self into becoming itself by becoming intelligible to itself. In other words, the self becomes no thing before a negative presence that recollects its conflicting elements into a higher order unity, a logos, and inspires its will to resolve itself proleptically to this eternal aspect. Just as the child's necessity is grounded by the sight of her knowing parent, so the self, by relating to another, can draw the breath of possibility without carrying into the infinite non-being.